So next of all, I'm delighted to welcome Minister Eamon Ryan to the stage. So Minister Eamon Ryan is the Minister in Environment, Climate and Communications and Transport. And obviously he's no stranger to most of us in the room, and has worked tirelessly over the last number of years and in previous administrations to get renewable energy really centre on the stage. We're at a very pivotal time, and we're delighted to have him here today.
Good morning, everyone. I'm very honoured to be here. We had our own party convention in the Royal Marine a number of years ago, and also I brought European energy ministers here about a year and a half ago. It was on relation to offshore wind, but it was a great place to bring them here. Brought some of them for a swim down the 40-foot, and so I'm very glad I hadn't realised the hotel was low carbon in its heating, zero carbon in its heating system. I should have added that on the day. I wanted to give you a brief overview from a political perspective. I think you've an interesting, looking at the programme ahead of you today, I think there's lots of really interesting presentations that'll go into the technical detail. I wanted to give just a political perspective of where we are, and which might influence hopefully some of the business decisions that you will have to make this switch. We all have to make the leap towards a zero carbon future in this country. Very briefly and broadly, first on the broader political background, everyone here will be familiar with the kind of deeply worrying and dramatic developments in climate science in the last 6 months, particularly where we've seen weather systems go outside any historic pattern previously. It's truly frightening what happened in September, with the monthly average temperatures globally being almost 1.8 degrees above the pre-industrial average. And the really worrying thing is the scientists don't quite know. That's outside what the models were predicting, and is cause for real concern, which is going to have to hasten our efforts to decarbonise. I'll be going to Dubai in the end of November, early December for COP28, when we have to start coordinating and making sure we meet the targets we've set ourselves to stay below 1.5 degrees to avoid runaway catastrophic climate change. I know it's obvious, but it has to be repeated now every time, because it is the driver of everything. It's going to be the driver of everything in energy, transport, industrial policy. In Europe, the European Union has put that reality centre stage. Ursula von der Leyen, very appropriately in my mind, President of the Commission, in this Commission 4 years ago, at the start of it, set out the strategy of Europe as a Green New Deal, putting the switch to low carbon, renewable energy sources, energy efficiency at the centre of European economic strategy as well as environmental strategy. The need for that has been further reinforced by the war in Ukraine, gas being used as a weapon of war. And it was interesting in terms of, I don't know, people might have seen her State of the Union address 3 weeks ago, when some people were speculating she might take the foot off the pedal. The opposite, it was further continuation that this is the economic strategy for Europe, and obviously within that, the strategy for Ireland. The political commitment for that, it's sometimes complicated, it's difficult. You've ongoing rows in Energy Council. I'll be there next week again, between nuclear and renewables. But actually, if you look at the truth of what's happened in Europe, we set out this legislative programme, 20 major pieces of legislation in the Fit for 55 process. That's 55% reduction in emissions by the end of this decade. And I think it's 19 of those legislative packages have now been agreed, including RED 3 and the Alternative Fuels Directive, which will have direct consequence for a lot of people in the industry here. So I just mentioned that broad political perspective because I think it gives the underlying, the ambitious targets that Europe are setting are really strong. And I keep coming back to the point that I think is going to frame both national policy, both industry, investment policy, in the coming 5-10 years. When I come back, Paddy, you were correct in saying in Ireland, we have made significant progress in the electricity and decarbonisation of electricity. We're about 40% renewable electricity in our mix, one of the highest integrations of wind in any synchronistic system in the world. And we're going to go further on that. The offshore wind, we're on track. We'll be seeing turbines here in 3-4 years' time off the coast of Dublin and Wicklow. But any assessment of where we haven't delivered, I think what would stand out is in renewable heat. We haven't seen the scale of development, as you said, Paddy, in terms of that the crisis would warrant. And that has to change. And I want to set out briefly some of the measures that governments are taking to try and make sure we do change and see a step up in renewable and use of bioenergy in a whole range of different areas, in transport, in heat, as well as in electricity. And I would also add a new kind of growing area, the circular economy. So I might just very briefly reflect, if I can, on some of the developments in that regard from a government perspective. One of the first things I'd say is we have in Ireland a very strong climate law. It was agreed by some 125 members of the Oireachtas, with only 10 voting against. It has real strong annual climate plan iterative process, which requires adaptation or change if you're not on track within the 3-5 year budget periods. First period up to 2025, second period to 2030, third one after that. That we're doing a constant reviewing process. Is, are we on track and do we have to change, or how do we change if we're not? Beneath that climate law, having introduced it, we've set up 6 task forces and a whole variety of other working groups to try and do what works best in government, is when you get out of silos, when you don't have just departmental limits in terms of this is Department of Agriculture, this is Department of Enterprise, this is Department of Environment. We've set up these task forces designed to really get an integrated approach in government, including with outside agencies, including with industry, academia and others. The first one was an offshore wind, because it is the huge economic opportunity for the state. The second was in sustainable mobility, because transport's our hardest, biggest challenge. Actually, it's harder than agriculture, harder than energy. But the third one, I think, is probably most relevant for the people in this room, is the task force on heat and the built environment. We have 3 others in climate communications, in just transition and in land use review. And actually that land use review one is of real importance as well. But I'll focus on those 2 just briefly to explain to you what's happening, so you have an understanding where some of these policies are coming from. The heat task force, as I said, involves a variety of different, we have typically project management teams supporting, the likes of EY, I think, on the heat task force. And they are designed to focus on what do we do in the next 3 years to deliver on our strategy. It's hugely important in terms of developing our anaerobic digesting system. That's been decided, that's been progressed within the heat task force. It is going to be critical in terms of, related to that, in the land use task force, looking at what is the source of material we have available to us? What is the use of the land that will give what type and what timeline of wood material or other crops to be able to be used in the bioenergy sector? So those 2 task forces and their work are critical. We try and keep an open, transparent approach. We have the National Climate Dialogue in a few weeks' time, where I'm asking the task force groups to present, to share information as to what's happening and what we need to do. In transport, maybe just very briefly, just going to very briefly touch on the surface. You'll go into much more details later on today, I'm sure. But transport, as I said, is probably the area where we have the greatest difficulty. We have 7 decades of kind of car-dependent model of transport that was pursued, and it's very hard for us to make the switch back towards an active travel public transport system. But it also involves, because transport is so challenging, obviously switching away from the use of petrol and diesel, fossil fuel in the transport system towards the electrification, but also critically the use of non-fossil, lower carbon transport solutions. The We've been doing this for quite some while. I was Minister of Energy from 2007 to 2011, and I was very proud. At that time, we introduced the renewable fuels obligation. It was about 4% of transport fuels blended into the petrol and diesel. We're up to about, I think it's 17% at the moment, and the trajectory on that is up to 49% by 2030 of all renewable fuels. There is, as I said, mentioned earlier on, we have the Renewables Energy Directive, which is particularly strong in also promoting renewable fuels of non-biological origin, a new development. I think it's 1% we're setting as the target for 2025, 5% by 2030. And that's an area where we're establishing a particular working group within our department as part of this way of working with different government departments, pulling agriculture in and ET&E and others. I think the first meeting of that is next week, and looking to see how do we develop strength in that area and capability as well. There's a lot of developments in the whole use of HVO, which is really welcome, really important, really significant, and gives us the opportunity to turn waste products into transport fuels. We have to be careful not to, I slightly careful, nervous when we go around the country and everyone's seeing HVO as the solution to their whatever needs, be it in the transport, heat or other sectors. We have to particularly be careful because there is significant concern around the international trade in HVO in terms of, is it all really waste cooking oil, or is there a variety of different paths that fuel oils are taking, which is leading to land use change, the loss of rainforest in the likes of Indonesia. So it's just something we have to be careful about in how we regulate, how we make sure that we're using HVO in the best application particularly in the transport sector. I think it's where it's going to be needed most, because in the haulage and other heavy transport sectors, we don't have easy electrification alternatives. I mean, they're coming, but it's there where we will use, as I see it, rather than the likes of domestic boilers. I don't think HVO is going to be the particular option in that regard. Again, transport work, we've done some good work. The Bernard Cleary did that study back in 2022 in terms of what is exactly the likely scale of feedstock we have to be able to provide for our biofuels strategy, our biofuel transport strategies. So I think, as you're saying, Paddy, we have a lot of good studies and policies in place. We now need to make sure we actually go ahead and deliver them. I'm only skating across the surface here and apologise if we can't go into the detail of everything that's happening. Just very briefly to go on to the heat sector, because heat is the forgotten child of this transition. Well, if someone was to ask me why, I think it's because you don't necessarily get the front page when you put a new boiler in. It's not exactly politicians, it's not their first most glamorous assignment, cutting the ribbon on a heating system, but actually it's the one where we have to make the fastest move now, because to meet our targets and to protect our country from a world which is unsafe if it's dependent on fossil fuels. And again, there's very significant developments there. You'll all be aware the renewable heat obligation we're looking to put in place in 2024. The existing SSRH, as was mentioned, I mean, we have a 300 million budget allocated for that within the NDP. Budget this year, 3.9 million. And I think we have broadly, I tend to agree with what was just said in the opening introduction. I think some of those policies are well thought through. They're based on experience. We've been thinking and working on this for 10, 15, 20 years. We really need to make sure that they are starting out to be picked up. And I think what I think was interesting, you mentioned some companies, the likes of Danone, the likes of the hotel here. I think our way into really accelerating the market is through putting the implications, particularly on the larger commercial companies, that they have their Scope 3 climate target emissions that they have to meet, and they have to start looking at their area, which might, I mean, they're not looking at their heating or as the core maybe business strategy, but by pushing the Scope 3 emissions requirements they have, I think we can see this industry lift as that other industry, as those larger biopharma, dairy, hospitality, other industries start to look at how they meet their Scope 3 emissions. The SSRH is very much targeted, as I said again, it's not We're going to very much target those areas where either it's very high heat intensity, where you can't use a heat pump and you want to take the fossils out. The temperatures above 200 degrees or industrial heat processing systems is where there's obvious opportunity. And then a lot of lower grade heat, anything under 150, 160 degree temperature. I'm told as I go around Europe and I'm listening to the experts, what they say to me is heat pumps are going to take over. They're just better technology for low grade heat. They're going to win not just in domestic, but also in industrial low grade heat applications. And I think we really do need, and we'll continue to look at, what are the supports for those technologies to particularly close those two gap areas. We are also, as I said, in this kind of range of different strategies. I think we're fortunate SEAI having done a very significant and I think really detailed and good national heat strategy. So we're not without, and indeed the resourcing of SEAI, it's practically almost doubled in staff in the last 3 years. It's significantly scaling up its budget and its capabilities. So we have a lot of tools in place. I was during the budget this week, I kind of really strongly came home to me that our carbon tax system is working. It's because in the middle of a budget process, I had this separate source of funding that's guaranteed, 100 million euros each year going into the heat mainly retrofitting area. But it gives SEI and gives our department real strength that we know we've got a budget process that's robust, that's going to increase year in, year out, no matter how difficult it is negotiation with health or education or social welfare. We're on a path towards expanding our department, having a larger budget, being able to do more, and that I hope will give industry confidence in the skill and capability of the state that we're there to match you in delivering the change, the scale of change we need to make. Lastly, I'm sorry, I'm kind of skating, as I said, over the other areas, but I was just prompted to think about this when I met a young gentleman, so I can't remember his name, coming in, and we were talking briefly about biochar, Stephen, because I do think the whole circular economy side of this industry is going to become more significant. I think we're looking in that land use strategy that I mentioned earlier on, which is really key. It's looking to the land use task force that we've set up. Geraldine Talon, the former Secretary General of the Department of Environment, is chairing it. Mark Scott from UCD is leading the technical group. We've spent the last 2 years doing a lot of the research, technical research with the EPA and Chagas to underline the whole strategy. So Mark Scott now as a technical team taking that to the next phase. And Rory O'Donnell, former head of NESC, the National Economic and Social Agency, it's the state's think tank, he's in the engagement side. That land use plan has to optimise. How do we develop rural Ireland, reduce emissions, increase biodiversity and reduce nitrogen ammonia pollution? But I think there's another output from it, another optimization. What is, as I said earlier on, the wood and other biofuel and biomass material that can come out of the land use plan that we have, land use strategy, and what are the materials impacts for that in a new more circular economy? How much of that wood material can we used to create cross-laminated timber to go into construction industry as a store of carbon for 100 years plus? How much biochar could we manufacture to create a heat energy use in the first place in the creation of the biochar, but also of the soil additive systems that would help us reduce some of the other nitrogen and other fertilizers to manage our soil in an effective way. And I just think that that sort of circular thinking, where we're starting to really reduce the waste, use materials in a kind of evolving circular economy way, moving away from plastics towards bioplastics, is the real key. I'll finish with someone I quote a lot because I met him a few times and he inspired me. Hermann Scheer, he was a German politician. He wasn't a Green, surprisingly. He could have been. He was a Social Democrat. He died about 10, 15 years ago. But he was really the father of, or one of the founding fathers of this whole renewable revolution. He was responsible, along with my green colleagues in Germany, for setting up all the supports for the biomass and other renewable industries that took off in the 80s, early 90s. And his book, The Solar Century, was set out this future, where was it going? And he was very interesting. He spoke about the farmers being the heroes and the foresters, that their frontline expertise and knowledge in terms of, yeah, that land there would be good for creating a bioplastics, that one there will be better for creating products that we can use in biofuels, that one there will be for renewable power, solar, and it's just that knowledge and connection to the land and the use of our skills in managing our land to deliver the energy sources of the future and the material sources of the future was his vision. And I think it's coming into shape. I think actually, like, we're in a very precarious place in the world, war rampant, climate terrifying, but there's also changes happening which would give you some hope. The energy and clean investment in the world this year is 1.7 trillion. The investment in fossils is 1 trillion. According to the International Energy Agency, that trillion, 1.7, to meet our climate needs has to go to 4.5 by 2032, and the fossil fuel has to halve. And the skill and the investment in Ireland we have in this area is real. We've every reason to be good at this. And I think the policy context I set out only very briefly is moving in this direction, and I hope it gives you and your industries and your businesses the foundations you need to take off. We haven't done so yet enough in the bioenergy area, but we need to. And I'm looking forward to working with the association, with the various companies involved, to make sure that happens. I'm going to have to leave after I speak because I'm due to a management board meeting at 11 o'clock that I can't miss to talk about some of these various task forces we have in place. But I want to thank you for inviting me here today and wish you the very best of luck today. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Minister, for that. I think we can all look back on what was said there, and there are certain things that we all have seen over the last number of years, and the dramatic change in weather patterns is definitely signifying a change in climate. The reasons for doing this are very apparent, and the Minister would recall when he was first in that role over a decade ago, that the conversations we were having then were very much about trying to get a recognition of just the effects that were going on, but also in terms of the solutions that were there. And in many ways, the conversations we're having today, we wish we were having them 10 years ago. But however, there is a lot that was said there. There is a number of things we've picked up from that, and I suppose we will always argue over certainly the small matters. But in terms of the direction that everything needs to go, in terms of, from an EU perspective, in terms of security of supply, in terms of meeting our sustainability goals and requirements, we're all definitely seeing policy has moved solidly into that position. There will be obviously differences in what technologies we apply and people's views on that, and I suppose we as an organisation are very much focused on getting the best out of the bioenergy resources that are available and ensuring they're going to the right sources. So